Welcome to The Check-In, a podcast by Telos where we explore the headlines from Israel, Palestine, and across the world, wading into the complexity of seemingly intractable conflict to discover the power of peacemaking to heal us, our community, and our world. This is your host, David Cadabaugh, checking in from Washington, D.C. Today, we brought together a true A-team for a retrospective discussion. This month marks 5 years since a summer of protests across the world for Black lives, dignity, and justice. And this past Sunday, as of the time of this podcast being released, marked 5 years since the world watched in horror as George Floyd was murdered by police officer Derek Chauvin on the streets of Minneapolis. His murder for all of us was a shocking display of the brutality of police violence and disregard for Black life in this nation. But for many of us, it wasn't a surprise. Already by that time in 2020, many of us had responded with horror at the murder of Breonna Taylor by police in her own home under a no-knock raid in Louisville, Kentucky. The summer of 2020 saw the largest mass mobilization in U.S. history in response to this violence in decades and even centuries of violence against Black life. And it echoed across the world as millions took to the streets to demand justice, police reform, and a greater reckoning with our history of racial inequity, white supremacy, and violence. There's a lot of hope during that summer, hope that our communities would begin to ask questions about our history, pursue lasting structural changes to our society, and begin to take serious steps towards true repair. And in the years since, we've worked hard at Telos to create space for this work through our ReStory US program, which gives Americans an opportunity to encounter the realities of our history through a pilgrimage across the Deep South. But it's not just historical education. It's also training in the work of justice and imagination, an experience that is meant to break your heart as much as inspire you with a vision of the spirit of justice, as our friend Jamar Tisby would say. So today we want to have a conversation and review of what the past 5 years have meant for that program and more broadly, perhaps even our country. Where have we seen this program work? How has the world changed around it? And what might be its future as we continue to face mounting challenges to honest conversations about race, history, and justice in our nation? So we have a big task before us, team. Thanks for joining us for this call. We have Todd Deatherage, Telos co-founder and executive director. Where are you checking in from?
I'm at home in Annandale, Virginia today.
Beautiful. It's a beautiful spring here in the DC area. So I'm glad to be here alongside you, Todd. We have Telos Director of US Programming, Dr. DeSean Dyson. Where are you checking in from?
From my comfort zone of my front porch in Jackson, Mississippi.
And we have former Director of ReStory US and now Co-Executive Director of Administration and Operations at Sprout NOLA, Yvonne Therese Holden. Where are you checking in from, Yvonne?
From my home in New Orleans and also in front of my natural habitat, which is my gaming monitor you see right off.
Of course.
What's your game of choice these days, Yvonne? Where are you escaping?
So there is this game. Oh my goodness, I'm spacing the title. I just downloaded it. It's this beautiful story. It's something of the South. We can talk about it a little bit later, but I mean, for speaking about stories set in culture and history and lore and everything, this game is definitely something that I was surprised by. I'll get the name for it for everybody. It's something that I even think that like younger folks could play. It's more of a storytelling type experience that is just like pulled me straight in from the minute I started playing it. And then I had to hop up off it because I realized that it indeed would take too much of my time. But I'll get the name for everybody before this show wraps up.
That's great. Yeah, I pretty much systematically avoid video games because I have such an addictive personality. If I open it up, I'm locked in. I've been watching The Last of Us recently, and I've been dying to get into the video game. Man, that story is so good. And speaking of dystopian settings, we can bring it back into our current reality and the way in which we are all living in a world that it's unfolding before our eyes in ways that we did not expect, or perhaps we did. That's something we can talk about here. But let's dive into our conversation for today, folks, as we consider this ReStory program that the three of you have really spent so much time and energy spearheading and ideating around. And I want to begin this conversation with Todd. Can you give us a little bit of the origin story of ReStory US and how 2020, as this kind of focal point for our conversation, perhaps changed or even shaped its work further, since it began prior to 2020, but of course that was such a pivotal moment in our nation's history?
Yeah, when Greg Khalil and I started Telos back in 2009, our sole objective at the time was just to help Americans better understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the American role in it, and to bring about a movement of people, hopefully, that would contribute to the mutual flourishing of all through the work of justice and healing and repair. And that way, that was the big goal. That was our Telos. We knew we were doing a particular kind of work. We hesitated to even call it peacemaking because of the way that that has a very unserious connotation for a lot of folks. But we knew that it was based on some universal truths and principles about how the world works and how we are to live in it and engage it in certain kinds of ways. But after taking a number of leader delegations there over a period of years and having people come back over and over again and saying, you didn't just give me a new way to see that story or those stories, you gave me a whole new set of glasses to see the world. I really want to apply a lot of these things I've learned from people there and from Telos and from others into situations here at home. And particularly, we were having leaders ask us how to deal with our own long history of racial injustice and white supremacy in the U.S. and how to better understand the stories we needed to hear so that we could do the work we needed to do. And so we were really hesitant at first because we just didn't feel like that we had the credibility to step into that space. There were people who'd been, devoted their whole lives to doing that work and had real experience and real expertise and knowledge that we didn't have. And yet, over time, we kind of allowed ourselves to be persuaded that what we were doing actually was something that could be contributive to that work in an important way and could reach communities that might not otherwise be reached by some of the work that was being done. And so there was a rationale that we kind of bought into. And so Greg, as he often does, led the way and began to go down and do meetings and try to meet people. And one of those people he reconnected with ultimately was Yvonne. She may want to tell their own story, but, Yvonne and Greg had gone to school together back in San Diego back when they were much younger. And Yvonne was the director of operations at Whitney Plantation at the time. And so they kind of reconnected through that. But he began to delve into kind of what this would look like. We had other core friends and partners. One of our board members for many years is Bishop Ronnie Crudup from Jackson, Mississippi, who has been involved in our work since he went on a trip to Israel Palestine with us maybe back in 2011, somewhere around in there. And so he began to help us introduce us to people, particularly in Mississippi. And anyway, we built out the network over time and began to scout in I think starting in 2017, 2018. And we changed our mission statement and expanded our work to be what it is now, and really added this in as a second area of focus and attempt to organize people around.
Todd, give us some idea of how what happened in 2020 in those conversations shifted at all your thinking around what this program's aims were, its intentions. Was that a kind of a moment of pivot, or was it a moment of clarification of, this work is so necessary in this moment?
Yeah, I don't think it was a moment of pivot, but was certainly a moment of clarification that this work really is essential, that America will always stay trapped in these cycles until we figure out, if we're honest about how we got here and how we stay here, until we're willing to face our own story in all its honesty. Everybody loves to tell a good story about themselves. I mean, we all like to put our best face forward, but there's a lot of stuff that we have to be honest about. And there's fear, there's resistance, there's all the things that, that come up when you try to be honest about about things you've done historically and are continuing to do that are wrong. But I think as any of us if we're really truthful about this, we know that the way to a better version of ourselves is to be honest about what we're doing wrong and to bring those things to the light of day and be corrective about those things. And so I think this moment after this, horrible thing that happened with George Floyd got such attention and created such open questioning and energy in the country. And it felt like a really important opportunity to push more deeply into this work as us just playing a small part of what was going on in a much bigger way nationally, a national conversation that was opening up that gave us an opportunity to, again, we've had these opportunities in our history in the past where we had, a chance to go deeper into these things. You can look at Reconstruction. You can look at the Civil Rights Movement. There have been other moments in our history where we had a chance to be more honest, and that, and to the extent that we made some progress, and then we faced a resistance. And so all of that was, possible in that moment. And yet all of that ultimately starts to look like what history has taught us in the past, that we often, we make an advancement, we ask honest questions, we do some good work, and then there's a resistance to doing all of that, and we get pushed back again. And I think we're seeing those dynamics play out right now.
Absolutely. And I'm excited to explore that question and those realities as we go on in this conversation. But Yvonne, I want to draw you in here. I mean, Todd mentioned that you knew Greg in high school, which is such a fun connection and insight into him, and a special friendship outside of professional collaborations. But what's interesting about your relationship to ReStory is that you not only helped us launch this program, but you interacted with it before you were on our team as a member of the staff at the Whitney Plantation Museum, as Director of Customer Experience and Operations. And I'm curious how you began to think about this work of historical education, of immersion in your interactions with the ReStory program before you even got to Telos, and then how your thinking about the program perhaps changed as you came on to launch it, and the way you saw it working, the tensions maybe you experienced in the work. Tell us about your encounters with this program through the years, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try. I think something that just popped in mind is something that was reflected back to me by somebody that I met on a ReStory trip. We know David Johnson, who's a media video producer, does a whole bunch of really good work up in Chicago. In a conversation we had, he reflected to me, he was like, Yvonne, it sounds like that your interaction with history is an exploration of who you are. And I thought that was the most precise comment that somebody could make about me as a, he saw me and he saw really by spending time how I use history, not just as something that I work to interact or work to connect other people with, but saw how deeply I use it as a tool to explore my own identity, and also to my position where I am and how I understand the world through it, or how I have become to understand the world through interacting with history. And so, when I think about not just my work at Whitney, but also how my work with Telos prior to me becoming a part of Telos, I think that has been the primary way that I have navigated all of it. That has been the thing that drives me, the reason why I feel that history plays such an important role, because it gave me so much. Just exploring the history, understanding it more, gave me so much, and I wanted to share that with literally everybody else too. I'll say this though about Telos, and it's something that I felt when I first became introduced to the work of Telos, and it's something that I really feel now, is that I want us to think about when we were younger and how our curiosity, how we felt when we encountered something new, something that we didn't know anything about, but something that really just grabbed us, and the sense of wonder and curiosity that drove us. I feel that Telos brings people on a journey of self-discovery that allows people to explore things, and allows people to be in an environment that allows people to explore. Now, Telos provides experiences that do this with the most pressing issues of our era. So it doesn't do this with immersive experiences that are light. It does it through immersive experiences that carry significant amounts of gravity. But I think the magic of Telos is the fact that it pulls people into these experiences where people can explore, where people can wonder, where people can ask questions. It doesn't prescribe with a heavy hand what it wants from people. Or how it wants it from people, right? Like, I should rephrase that. What we want is to build a community of empathy. What we want to do is build a community of action. What we want to do is build a community of mutual flourishing. But Telos doesn't go in with a heavy hand telling people how to be, how to act, how to think. It allows people to fill in what these experiences will mean for them, not just with the cohort, not just with the relationships they build on these journeys, but also too, it allows people to fill in what this will look like for them when they return back home. And so my work with Telos, my impressions of Telos didn't change. What happened is that they expanded a lot more through my work with Telos. And now, I've been, doing other work for a little over a calendar year, about a year and a half, I think, away from Telos now, a little bit, maybe under. And even from this vantage point now, that definitely remains the same. The thing, though, is that with all that said, one of the lessons that I've learned through working with Telos is that truly shifting culture to a more equitable one, especially in this current climate, it's challenging, it's difficult. It will ask a lot of you. And for somebody like me who is aware of the challenge, working in Telos really, really, really opened up some things I didn't truly understand about what it takes to, continue to do this work. It takes conviction. It takes a lot of fortitude, but also, most important, it really requires that community around you to support, each other as you go through this journey. So I hope that answers your question somewhat.
I mean, Yvonne, in the same way you said that David saw you as he said that thing to you, I think you saw Telos. I feel like that is a very seen kind of comment to make, because I think the thing that we have always tried to do, and the thing that really, the better answer to the original question you asked me, David, is probably why did we get involved in this? Ultimately, I think we became convinced that the core thing that Telos has done best, and we don't do a lot of things well, but one of the things we do really well is create a space in which people have the opportunity to be opened up, to go on a journey. We cultivate a space through giving people relationships and experiences and all that they need. And it's still up to us, each as individuals, to decide whether or not we want to go on the journey, whether we want to open ourselves up to see the world honestly and to do something about what we know and see, and to act out of that spirit. And you can't force people to do that. And that's the part of being human. Like, we have this agency and ability to make our own choices, but we create that space. And I think what Yvonne is so masterful doing, and what you have so helped us do from the very beginning, both at Whitney, at Telos, and now in just working with us in other ways, is to help create those spaces, and the work that you have done to transform people's lives. And I get this feedback all the time. Every time I have a group down there with you and they spend time with you and they come back transformed by what you have given to them. And you've poured out such out of deep knowledge and expertise and wisdom, but also just so much of yourself. And that's what you're getting at, is how hard it is to do that and sustain that. And then to keep doing that over and over again, to pour out yourself in such deeply personal ways and for people. And it's such a gift, and it's such a sacrifice too. And so I just want to take a minute to honor you also for all that you have historically done with us and without us. I mean, just in your life and the way you live in the world.
Absolutely. I would echo that as well. DeSean, I want to draw you in next. You've been in this role for coming up on a year now, a little under a year, maybe 9 months. Is that correct? Something like that.
Yep, that sounds about right.
And you have done an amazing job of helping us think through what are the new opportunities for ReStory of who we can be, and what are the limits of what ReStory can be. How do we recognize our expertise, as Todd has said, and really stay in that lane effectively. And so, thinking about this conversation, I'd love to hear from you. Where do you see? How would you identify ReStory's place in the larger movement of this work of justice, of this work of restoring America? How do you see our particular contribution for the ReStory program? What's our lane, perhaps?
Much of that is grounded in an idea of the bigness of movements and history in general. And so I realized as we were talking about, our, natural habitats and safe space, I actually bought like the chair I'm sitting in 2020. And during that summer, I could be found out here. I have 3 books that I read that summer. Stanley Carnell's Vietnam War, Jasmine Ward, Men We Reap, and LBJ 1968 about like a year in crisis presidential politics with assassinations in Vietnam and all these things. And one of the things I can recall a friend over and talking to me about, like with all that's going on, you think you would like focus in on our current context and how you could be better instructing and informing yourself on like what do we do now. And I was like, well, like there are 2 sides to that. One, there are echoes of what's happening that to understand this moment is understanding a lot more than this moment. And so to give it its due complexity is to acknowledge that it's not as simple as just looking at a moment and feeling like you have a full understanding of what you're seeing. And so the other side of that is honoring people with proximity to the very specific moment and letting them inform how you're thinking through navigating, developing that more deep understanding. And so that's one of the things that I think we all share in, like those like diverse passions and interests, those very specialized pockets of knowledge and wisdom and experience. But I saw something that it seems really informal and really there's a word that I'm looking for here. You know, when when the streets are talking, like who am I to speak for them sort of deal. Like it's not necessarily my job to always feel the need to articulate something when there are those who are uh, present and doing the work of telling their truth. And so, what is my role when, whether it be the streets or this community or this person is telling their story? How am I better steward of that information or that wisdom or that experience? And to Todd and Yvonne's point of being able to, create space and being able to enter into it like in an invitational way, being able to recognize the difficulty of, what it costs people to every day, have to live through that and for us to participate in that, even if temporarily. And so it's really naming the complexity of, going back to the reason I mentioned those 3 books is because um, these are complex issues. These are complex things. And so what I think the tension for me is to really want to elevate the importance of an event, but not let the context of a history that creates such circumstances get lost in the elevation of events. And so we do the work of letting the people, like let the streets talk, like let the people who are doing that work every day. Let the people who are in the midst of that struggle because they're living and breathing it, because they have to, because it's so close to who they are and it's so close to their core identity, and like that they've got to. And for those of us who are uniquely positioned to where we get to go and hear these stories and share these stories and connect, how do we intentionally utilize our space and our agency and our ability to be intentional about how we do that? And so
Mm.
it's, I think, a reframing of, a mentality that centers you and your ability, that says that you're infinite in your ability to go everywhere and do everything and save everyone, and sees the world as a much more decentered, power system structures, like people are working. It's one of the things I love about just the very nature of like coming up doing community work. There may be someone in a house 2 neighborhoods over who spent decades doing work very adjacent to the work that I've done, and I just never heard of them because like they don't come up in the system that I came up in, and they've done it in a very different way, but it's no less legitimate. And it just really kind of humbles you to like, okay, as some of us have the ability to bring in people, we have resources to platform through podcasts, through writing, through different things. How do we utilize those in ways that make sure that when appropriate, we center the people who we should center, and we tell the stories that we should tell the way that we can appropriately tell them?
DeSean, I think that's so helpful, the way that you're inviting us to consider the work of Telos and the work of everybody who goes on a Telos trip as this space for listening, for amplifying the stories of the folks who are doing the work on the ground every day and on our own. To think about this work as not reactionary to a specific event, but as a real deep excavation of our entire history and how it's bringing us to the present, and where it might inform where we can go in the future. That's something I want to move us towards next, considering where we are in this particular moment. And I wanted us to have this conversation now, given there's a lot of attention thinking about the past 5 years, and what it has meant for our nation in the context of this current administration opening up or pivoting perhaps the in some ways away from some of the gains that have been made politically and on a policy level in the past 5 years, which frankly, weren't extensive. There was a whole lot of excitement after 2020 and summer protests, and there was attention on various kinds of reform, police reform, and the like. And many of those reforms are now being rescinded, reimagined. We're facing an administration that is criminalizing even honest conversation about our history, about racial inequity or white supremacy. Books have been banned. Centers of historical education, including Whitney, have had their funds rescinded. There are even ways in which language is being literally criminalized, and perhaps not criminalized, but policed in our nation right now. We can't even use certain words in grant applications and the like. And so this moment is fraught with this kind of reactionary violence to these conversations that have been increasingly salient over the past 5 years, this excitement and hope for equality and equity and justice. And according to some polling done by Pew, there's a lot of cynicism right now about the effectiveness of those protests and these conversations. And I'm curious to know from you all how you reflect on what these past 5 years have meant. What has happened? Why are we where we are right now? And what it might say about how we have led or structured our movements, broadly for justice, but even this idea of this work of ReStory, of historical education. Yvonne, you named culture change is really hard work. It does not come quickly or come easily. and we're seeing the challenges of that right now. So I'm curious from folks how you think about where we are right now in the past 5 years, and what's happened, what's changed, and where it might be taking us.
These are all the questions that we are all asking ourselves, right? Not just us on this call right now, but so many people are asking these very questions. The things that I hold are many. So there's a lot of things that come to mind. In many ways, we can respond to this question. But I think first that, if we start with the idea of shifting culture, those of us on this call, and even those of us who are alive right now, we didn't start this culture shift. Our culture, if we're speaking specifically in the United States, has been shifting and evolving since the founding of this nation. Now, it's important to not think about culture evolving in a linear line in one direction. It's something that morphs in ways that in some ways we agree with and other ways we don't agree with, sometimes things that we might be a little bit ambivalent about, but culture is constantly on this shift, right? We can see in this current moment that our administration is representative of the type of culture shift that we ourselves are not in alignment with, right? But it doesn't mean that the culture isn't shifting. They very much represent an aspect of culture that is, to put it really lightly, extremely challenging for most of us, but I think that, thinking about all of this on the longer trajectory, thinking about the fact that what is happening right now is something that is not necessarily unique, but it is unique to those of us who haven't experienced it. But also, too, understanding that because it's not unique, there's so much wisdom in the people who have seen what is happening in our country right now, the people who have lived through it, the methods and approaches that they've took to resist it. There is so much community, past, present, and there will be community in the future that will respond to these things in these challenging times. Does all of this mean that I feel that I'm not being affected, by everything that's happening right now? No, deeply troubled. I feel deeply troubled and deeply affected by all of this. But I think that it's also, while managing our day to day, while being involved in the things that we need to be involved with, while, continuing to meet our basic needs and continuing to cast a vision for the future, it is very important to not think that we are isolated in this time, that we are alone in this time, that there are not people out there that understand what exactly is we're going through, and that we can reach out to, right? That's really briefly in 2 minutes, sort of what it is that I how I start to approach these questions that you're asking.
I'll make a statement about the idea of the generational aspect of this. The year of George Floyd's murder and the mass protests, we changed the state flag in Mississippi. And I can remember, for me, that was a very difficult moment, um, because I had a lens that no one is going to be educated better because of that flag change. No one's life expectancy is going to increase. No one's ability to get it. I wanted tangible things to happen for the betterment of people in the community. And I had a moment where I saw Black legislatures in our state legislature who were rejoicing because they had been fighting for decades that that symbol was not symbolic of a state that we have just as much ownership to as anyone else who sits under that flag. And so I think it's this complex mixture where we all own sort of the legacy and the solutions, right? That part of me in that moment had to learn to rejoice with those who were rejoicing, that there was some victory there, that there were some gains there, that if left to my own, I would not have gotten there. Like, I would not have been able to exercise joy and celebration at the changing of a symbolic gesture to our community, because I wanted more. Like, I needed more from the state, I needed more from the leaders. And at the same time, I think as we talk about, you know, a word that we mention a lot when we have these conversations, like a reconstruction, a literal, tangible finagling of policies and structures and systems and representation that moves an institution of government towards something that looks less representative, that is less effective at serving certain populations, that is not functioning in a way that it did 2, 3, 4 years ago. That, I think, for someone like me who was saying, like, what are we doing about those issues? I wasn't wrong to say we need to be caring about those things too. And I think, to the generational point of I was making, that this has been the story forever. That it's been about coalitions. It's been about people who I often use the examples of Dr. King, and I've tried to source this, so I'm always very careful when I talk about it. But I watched a panel with a group of historians that referenced him meeting with Reverend Jesse Jackson towards the end of his life, and he was rather despondent that he had, in his public speeches, declared seeing the mountaintop and talked about giving these charges that really propelled like a legacy built in hope. But privately, he was struggling. Like, he was having a really hard time with, like, we've accomplished legislation, but it feels like the hearts of people in the way that this system in place operates, I don't know if it's really going to change. Like, if you start looking at the economic realities of, he wasn't just talking about the South. You start going to these major cities, you start looking at the civic disruptions, Watts and Compton and all these places, and he kind of had this deep anguish about him that I think, to look at our current generation and to be both people who, I used this term a few days ago, like, to be a trafficker of hope, and to treat it like a thing that, like, is not easy or convenient or something that's very accessible, but it's something. And those who have it and possess it have to be careful with it, and you have to be very intentional about it. But the reason that it's almost, contraband in a society like ours is because there's so many reasons not to have it. Like, there are so many things that you would see that would make it anti-intuitive, like, counterintuitive, or like foolish to lean into that. And I think we have a tradition of people that have shown us that even to the very end, they teetered on both sides of that. Like, even as Dr. King wrestled with this idea of, am I really making a difference? What he was doing publicly was spending his energy believing, well, if I could just, like, turn this into a coalition movement, if we could really focus in on economic equality, if we could, looking at other figures, we just think about Malcolm X. I think it would have been 100 years old, and like, the change of philosophy towards as he was evolving, may not be the right word, but as his mentality and perspective was changing, think of all of these leaders who, over time, their view of the world was morphing because they had these experiences and interactions. That I think is one of the things that we have to morph with the times. Like, to be traffickers and movers and believers in a arc towards hope is to not be sunk and, you know, um, anchored when you see progress stymied, or when you see something happen that tells you, oh, like I can speak for myself. I never believed that we had reached the turning point where things were about to get better, and all of a sudden people got it. The rhythms are too familiar to me, but I knew that our iteration, like our generation, was needing to figure out its own things, and that's going to happen as long as this country perpetually continues to figure these things out. And we have a lineage, we have a heritage of that story that I think we lean into and do that work.
That's so good, DeSean. It reminds me of something that I saw on Instagram. I believe it was Dante Stewart, who was reflecting on commentary from people, noting how what we're seeing today isn't entirely, unrecognizable from our history, right? That we have these moments of time where we see these reactionary movements, where the deep roots of injustice and supremacy show themselves, right, more clearly to us, and we are reminded of how profound and deep the struggle is. And yet we also have this inheritance, as you're saying, of history, of folks from our nation who have continued to stand up in defiance to those roots and say there is another way forward. And so what Dante Stewart was saying is that, it's very easy to say, we've been here before, and to kind of acknowledge the connections to our past, but in some way, this moment is new, it's different, it's new kinds of challenges, it's connected to all of those challenges. But instead of saying we've been here before, he says we were made for this. Like, we have the tools, we have the connections and relationship to be able to respond in hope for justice, for equity. And I really love that way of framing it, I think, as what you're getting at, DeSean. Todd, I'd love for you to jump in here with any reflections you have, especially thinking in the broad swath of our history. There's a lot of analogies specifically made to the Reconstruction era and the, quote, redemption movements of the white South to reclaim power, and the opportunities that might, present to us to learn from that era. How are you thinking about what are our steps forward right now, informed by our past and what we've inherited?
Well, I do think, studying history is really such an important exercise, not just because I have a degree in history and love it myself, but I think history definitely can show us, things about ourselves over time that are perennially true. And yet we don't live in a deterministic universe. The honest way to live is to be appreciative of the history that brought us to where we are. But we're not trapped in that story. We have abilities to create new pathways forward and new stories. And I think, again, that is the work of every generation. And the what you said, DeSean, is very powerful to me. And David, your quote of from Dante Stewart about we were made for this, and we have a moment to step into, and we have to be appreciative of how difficult change really is that we seek, and yet that it's ours to do, and we have to live in. We can't fall into the despair that is readily a choice for us in very difficult times. We have to continually, perennially, kind of step into that. And not everybody can do it every day and all the time. And that's why we have to do it in community. And so, again, going back to something you said earlier, Yvonne, but this idea of we have to remember we're in this together. And that community has to be a localized community of people that we're in deep relationship with, but it also we have to connect ourselves to others who also see the world very similar to how we do and are trying to do work and lean into each other. And sometimes it's easier for, others to step forward when everybody can't do it. And just remembering that. So I think just reminding ourselves of that we're not alone in this work. We're not alone in our particular moment in time and in our place. We're not alone historically. We stand on the shoulders of a lot of folks who've tried to do good things over time and have done good things over time and have had failures and successes over time. And we'll have our own failures and successes, but it is ours to do. And so remembering our agency, remembering our, responsibility, our complicity, our responsibility to do something with what we have, and in the moment that we live in, is really important. And to just really to understand the times and understand that there are real fears that people have, real and imagined fears that people have that often are underneath so much of what we're pushing back against, and that there are people who capitalize on those fears and they traffic in those fears. I mean, you talked about trafficking in hope, DeSean, which is ours to do, but there's a lot of folks who traffic in fear, and they build whole lives and careers out of that work. And so figuring out how to, to address those things in ways that actually allow people to move beyond their fears, to cultivate the empathy that's required, in every generation, to see ourselves as interconnected, and to really reject these zero-sum games, this sort of scarcity mindset that says that, somehow if someone else benefits from something, it's a hit against me, and remembering what we learned from so many of those who came before us, including Dr. King and others, that it's not a zero-sum game. It's we are all interconnected, and my actual flourishing as a white guy living in a very affluent part of the country in the DC suburbs is directly connected to my friend and colleague DeSean, and to Yvonne, and to people that are dear to me in Selma and in Palestine and in Israel and in other parts of the world, that we're all interconnected, and letting that be the basis of how we, kind of move forward and act in the world.
That's beautiful, Todd. I am thinking about Michelle Browder, our partner in Montgomery, who has this line as she's bringing folks around Montgomery, giving us a historical tour. She wears these big red glasses. It's kind of a bit of her brand. And she gives everybody this red glasses, and she says, as she's giving this tour, once you see, you can't unsee, but once you see, you can be free. And I love that invitation as you're naming us to move beyond the fear of really seeing what is true about our past and what is true about our present. But that actually doing that work of encountering our history, of encountering it in all of its brokenness, and encountering the depths of the roots of supremacy and injustice, it is scary, right? There is a lot of fear, but there's actually freedom on the other side, as you're suggesting. There's freedom for all of us, right? And that's the joy that we get to step into if we really do this work and hold some courage. So we're inviting you into that with us, folks, into some courage, into some freedom. And we know it's hard. This moment is a true challenge for so many of us, and some of us more than others as well. But there is opportunity here if we learn how to do this work together in coalition and alongside each other. So we want to do that work with you. We're here for it in the long haul. And I'm grateful to be in relationship with the three of you and so many others. I'm grateful that you spent some time to talk with us today. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. It was great to spend time this morning.
Great to see everyone.
Very much appreciate the conversation.
Thanks for listening to this show. If you enjoy it, leave a rating and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, become a donor to Telos. Check out the work of Sprout NOLA. Also, South of Midnight, if you're looking for your next video game, upon Yvonne's recommendation. We'll leave the link in the show notes. We'll see you next time, folks.